Okay, geweldig. So Basil told us in the Mishnah that all karbonis, even a carbon chatos, if you spritz only one matana of dam, it's going to be a kosher carbon. And the Gemara says that it's totally in if you hold yesh aim mikra or yesh aim l'masayris. The Gemara says that 3 times in the parshas of chatos it mentions the word karnos. Now it's pronounced karnos plural, and the Baal Beishamah holds yesh aim l'mikra. You focus on how it's read, and since each karnos is read plural, each one amounts to 2. 2 times 3 is 6. Now, out of the 6, 4 are the mitzvah, and 2 are repeated to tell you that it's ma'akiv. So therefore, you need a minimum of 2 zrikas. That is how Beis Shammai learns. Beis Hillel learns yesh aim l'mikra. It says karnois twice without a vav, which would sound like it says karnas, which would be singular. Only the 3rd time does it say karnos with a vav, which would mean 2. Therefore, each of the 2 karnoses without the vav is 1. The karnos with the vav is 2. You have a total of 4, and therefore we say 3 is la mitzvah and 1 is la'akiv. So the first thing that we have to point out is that the pasuk, if you look at our chamashim and our sefer Torah, all the karnos do not have a vav. So there must have been another nusach of the Torah written with a vav. So we see that there's definitely some controversy even today as to how our Torahs are supposed to be written, because our Gemara has a different version of the correct spelling of karnos than our chamashim and our sefer Torah. But Al Kapam, the Gemara asked, if you only have 4 karnos, and we know by kochim, in order for something to be ma'akiv, it has to be repeated, and all of these 4 karnos are only mentioned once, so they should all be only the mitzvah, and there should be no requirement even for a minimum of 1 zrika. So the Gemara offers 2 terutzim for that. One teretz the Gemara offers is kapara b'chdi loy ashkechad. It's simply not logical to suggest that a korban will be mechaper if there is not even 1 zrika. And the second pshat that the Gemara offers is Rabbi Basil doesn't hold straight yesh aim l'mikra, rather it's a compromise. If you say yesh aim l'mikra, we only have 4 karnos. If you say yesh aim l'masaris, you have 6. So Basil says we'll compromise between yesh aim l'mikra and yesh aim l'masaris. We'll say we have 5 karnos, 4 l'mitzvah, and 1 to be makar. And that's where
this is pretty shocking that there's a different girsa of the Torah itself with regard to this missing vav or extra vav, or is that resolved by the Rishonim or somehow even in the Gemara?
It just brought, and the only thing I saw mentioned is that our Torahs do not have that, which I would love a greater explanation for that, because we actually have a Sefer Torah that doesn't read like the Gemara. So I don't have a resolution for
that. Okay, so what does that do to all the codes?
We better not tell them about it.
Okay.
It will cause a lot of stress. But there has to be a pshat in it, but I didn't see anybody who mentions anything about it. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. So the Gemara says, now that you've developed this new concept of Beis Hillel, who says you compromise between yesh aim l'mikra and yesh aim l'masaris, you look at what numerical value the mikra would tell you, what the masaris would tell you, and you take half of it. Well, then we have a problem by tefillin. El mayata tefillin. How do we know you have 4 bottom? Because it says l'toitafos 3 times, twice without the vav, and 1 with the vav. I'm actually wondering, but what do we have in our Torah? In our Torah, it actually does align this time that the 3rd toitafos actually does have a vav. Okay, so Zok to Gemara, Hare Kan Arba. Chaf Lamed Mem. Let's see, Chaf is L'Tetafos Arabav. No, actually, it doesn't line up either, because in our Chumash, it's the second the Taitafis also has a vav. The Gemara is quoting that the second Taitafis does not have a vav. So there's going to be an issue as well. So I'll call upon them, Harek and Arba, that's how you have a total of 4. Why don't you say the same argument as Basil said earlier? Ahani Krab, Ahani Mesiris. And therefore, Chamisha Bati Boilam Evad. Vibalt the Mikra says 6, and the Mesiris says 4, so let's go 5. You should need 5 bottom. Zok Gemara, because Rabbi Hill doesn't hold that the way we know you have 4 bottom in the film is from this method. Rather, Savalok Rabbi Kiva the Omar Tat Kaspi means Shtayim. In the language spoken in Kaspi, Tat means 2, and Pas Afriki in the language spoken in Africa also means Shtayim. Now you might ask, why would the Torah use an African word or a Kaspi word? So the first it's Punt Fakert. Most languages have roots in Lashon Kodesh, and therefore they borrowed some words. So the whole point is, since you see that these words in those languages mean 2, and the Torah uses those words, vice the choice that's a Torah word that meant 2, and it was adapted by the Kaspi and adapted by the Afrika. It says basukos 3 times, twice without a vav and once with a vav. Are you going to tell me that you need 5 walls? Ahani mikra, ahani mesoris, kamisha dafnosi, boy lemevat. No one's going to say you need 5 walls. In the sukkah, we know you need 2 walls plus a tefach. So how do we understand basukos? Zok Gemara, that's different. You have 5 times that it says basukos. Because as we learned, there's a compromise between Yeshem Lemikra and Yeshem Lemsoris. So Basukah is twice without the vav, once with the vav. That's a total of 6. If you're gonna base it on the pronunciation, if you're gonna base it on what's written, it'll only be 4. If you split the difference between 4 and 6, you get 5. You have 5 Basukahs. But Chad Kra Kulei Lugufe. One pasuk is just for the mitzvah of sukkah, and one puzzle of sukkah is just to tell you that you need to have schach, and therefore you have how many left? 3, and out of the 3, asoy hilchasa v'garasa l'shlishtis v'ukimtata. The halacha l'Moshe Moshe comments on one of the walls, one of the 3 required walls, that it only has to be a tefach wide. Okay, so let's look at another place where we have a similar halacha. It says in Parshas Tazria, it says by a Yeledes who has in the keva, she's Tamei Shivu Ayim Kinidasa, so it says twice in the pasuk that she's Tamei Shivu Ayim for 2 weeks. But once the Shivu Ayim is spelled with a vav, and the other time is spelled without a vav. Now when Shivu Ayim is spelled without a vav, it should be pronounced Shivim, 70. So you have one pasuk that says Shivu Ayim, which is 14. You have one pasuk that says Shivim, which is the Ksiv. It's going to be 70. So you have 70 plus 14, it would be 84. But according to Basil, where you split the difference, so the way you would look at it is, if you have 14 versus 70, what's the difference? 70 minus 14 is 56. If you split the 56, then you get 28. So if you take 14 of Shivuayim and add 28 to it, which is half of the difference between Shivuayim and Shivim, 28 plus 14 is 42. So based on Beis Hillel's logic of splitting the difference, Ahani Krav Ahani Mesiris, Arboim V'Train Boy Lemesa. There should be not 14 days, 2 weeks of Yemei Tahira, of Yemei Tuma. There should be 42 days. Zok Gemara, Shiny Yosem B'Chsiv Kinidasa. It says V'Tama Shavuayim Kinidasa. So we're basing it all on the Nida, which is 7 days. So therefore, 70 is way too far out. In this case, there'd be an exception. You wouldn't consider the Yesh Aim L'Mesiris and read it as Shevim, because since the Torah says Kinidasa, clearly it's something that's close to what the Tumah of Anida is. As Rashi says, Mashma Shelo Yored Akas of Laminin Yomim, Elo Laminin Shavuos. It's clear that the Torah is talking about weeks, not about days. Shanida Shavua Echad, a nida is a nida for 7 days. Vayoledes Shavuayim, and the Yoledes will be 2 weeks. Shimatayim Shivim, if you want to say that Vayoledes at 70 days, Hiflakta Miteris Nida Harbe, you're way off the target from what a nida would be. And we're comparing, the Torah is comparing the Tumas Yoledes to Tumas Nida. But if you say it means 2 weeks, that makes sense. A nida is 1 week, and the Yoledes is 2 weeks. Karbasa the Torah is nida. We had a whole bunch of different svaris to explain the shil shita that only one zrika is required. But our Tana learned it from a completely different place. It says v'chiber by the Parsha of Chatos. It says v'chiber 3 times. Rashi says specifically by the Sirnosi, by the Seira, and the Kasba of a Chatos Yochid. So it says v'chiber 3 times. Mipnei hadin, because of a kal v'chomer that we might have had. Sheyachar, v'loydinu, nemru domim lamata. It says that many korbanos need their dam spritzed lamata michut asikra, like the oila. Korbanos generally are spritzed on the bottom half of the mizbeach. The nemru domim lamata, but the Torah sometimes talks about dam that has to be spritzed on the top half of the mizbeach, namely by the chatas. So let's compare the 2 types of zrikas. Ma matan dam hamur lamata, all our kabbanas should nostam b'matana achas kiper, even if you only had 1 matana, it would be mechaper. Af damim ha'amurim lamaila, so too the dam of the chatas, which the Torah tells you has to be spritzed above the chut hasikra, maybe as well should nostam b'matana achas kiper, even if you only had 1 matana. So do we compare the dam of the chatas to the dam of all other karbonos that are spritzed on the mizbech chitzon? And just like those, the Yevid 1 matana would be enough. So too, for a chatas, 1 matana would be enough. Or maybe approach it from a different perspective. Never damim b'fnim. There are chatos that we bring b'fnim, and the never damim b'chutz, and there are chatos, the standard chatas, where you spritz the blood on the outside mizbech. Let's compare chatas to chatas. Ma damim mamurim b'fnim, just like the chiyuv to zrikas adam for karbonis chatas, where you have to spritz the blood on the inside, like a par halam davar shel tzibur, like a par kohen Mashiach, like the karbonis chatas of Yom Kippur, and in those the halacha is chiser achas mina matanos lo also lo klum. Every last matana has to be done specifically as it's prescribed in the Torah, with no deviation at all. We're going to even learn there's even a Shita who holds that the shiyarim, sharayim, if you don't pour those under your side, that will also passel the permit. That's how specific and exacting you have to be by the chatois hapnimis. So just like the chatois hapnimis, you have to do all these rikas. Maybe avdamim hamurim b'chutz chiser achas minamatonos lo also like them. So the question is, what do you compare? Do you compare chatos to other karbanos that you spritz on the outside mizbeach? Or do you compare the chatos of the outside mizbeach to the chatos of the mizbeach hazov and say that it requires all of the matanis? Let's try to see what is the chatos and chetonis. What are they more similar to? Don in chutz michutz, vein don in chutz mibifnim. Let's compare karbonos that you're makriv the blood on the mizbeach hachitzon, and don't compare it to a different class of carbon that you were marked to the blood, you zerk the blood on the inside. That's one perspective. Or maybe look at it from a different perspective. Don in chatas the arba kronos, mechatas the arba kronos, the al yechiach hutz. So compare chatas to a chatas, because there's 2 similarities that the chatas hachitzoni has to the chatas hapnimi. A is they're both chatos, and B is they both require the chatchila at least a zrika on 4 kronos. So you should compare them. And don't learn from the other kabbalas of chutz, because she'ein chatos v'arba kronos. They don't have these 2 similarities. They're not a carbon chatos, and they don't get their dam spritzt on 4 kronos. So therefore, maybe you should learn from the chatas hapnimi to the chatas hachitzoni to say that all 4 zrikas are mandatory. Talmud loimer. That's why we have the pasuk. The Torah is saying, don't worry about the details. You will have your kapara anyway. So we dash into 3 v'chipers. The Torah says you need 4. But v'chiper number 1. You know what? If you didn't do all 4, you did 3, it'll be good enough. V'chiper number 2. Okay, you didn't have 3, you only had 2. It'll also be a kapara. The third v'chiper is avapi shaloi nasan elachas. Now there's no fourth v'chiper, so therefore you only learn that you could compromise on 3 out of the 4 zrikas, but 1 is mandatory. That's how our Tana learns this halacha, that in Beis Hillel, that even a korban chatos b'di eved, 1 zrika would be enough. Fragt the Gemara, what are you talking about? You need the pasuk to tell you that the chatos brings a kapara. Why? It's not an extra word, v'chiper. The v'chiper is telling us that the korban chatos brings a kapara for its bailing. Amar Rava bar Ada, Mari Asberli. My Rebbe explained it to me. Amar Kra, the pasuk uses a double lotion of kapara, because the pasuk says v'chiper v'nislach. It doesn't say it one after the other. Let's look at the pasuk inside. It says kochel boy yaktir hamizbecha kechelav zevach hashlamim, and then it says v'chiper olav hakayin mechatasoi, and it says v'nisnach loy. Now, kippur and islach are really the same thing. Zui kapara, zui slicha. So therefore, the word v'chiper is extra because the pasuk already says v'nislach loy. So therefore, you still have 3 extra v'chipers to darshan, as we just stated. Frek Gemara, maybe darshan v'chiper differently. Ema v'chiper afalpi shaloi nosan ela shalosh l'mayla v'achas l'mata. Who said v'chiper is saying compromise on the zrika and you could completely eliminate 1? No. Maybe it just means the Torah says, where are you supposed to spritz the blood of a chatos? You're supposed to spritz it on the top half of the chuta sikra. What happens if you spritz only 3 where it's supposed to be spritzed and 1 you spritz below? Maybe that's what the v'chiper is telling you. So v'chiper alpha b'shloi nosan el shalosh l'maylo v'yachas l'mato. V'chiper alpha b'shloi nosan el shtayim l'mato u'shtayim l'maylo. Even if you had 2 in the wrong place, v'chiper, the third one is alpha b'shloi nosan l'maylo. Even if you spritzed everything lamata, maybe that's what the v'chiper is telling you, but not that it's kosher even if you didn't spritz at all. If you're going to say that, then imkain bitalta tayras arba kronos. So then you're saying it's not needed at all. You're totally mevatel arba kronos because you're saying you could spritz it on the bottom. And that can't be true because it says so in the Torah. As Rashi says, Imkein Yidoshinan, Kiper, Kaper, Apopi, Shenostan, Kulan, Lamatam, Lachut, but Talta Torah's Kronos, Haksuvim Bechatos. The Torah says you're supposed to make a Zrika on each of the Kronos. Viachinam Ksiv Kronos, the Hanulamayla. I mean, the Torah wrote spritz on the Kronos for nothing because then the Torah turns around a minute later and says, V'chiper, to tell you that you can do all those Zrikas on the side of the Mizbeach. Frag the Gemara, why is that a problem? If the pasuk says that yes, you could spritz on the bottom half of the mizbeach because of the word v'chiper, so liftlum, you should taka say that the Torah is saying you don't need kronos. Amar Rava, Zok Rava, I'll tell you why it cannot be talking about where you're spritzing. It's talking about spritzing itself. Ezo dover shetzarich shalish. There's only 3 v'chipers. If you have to apply the 3 v'chipers, what would be more logical? To apply it to say that you only need 1 out of 4, like we want to say, or to say that all 4 can be spritzed on the lower half of the mizbeach? Hava Omer, it's much more logical to say Elu Kronos. It makes more sense to say that the Kronos need 3. For Zot Rashi, Ezo Davar Shetzarach Shloisha V'chiper Hava Omer Elu Kronos. Uchadarmina, like we're saying, the Chol Chad V'chad Miyut Chada Keren. Every V'chiper says you don't need 4 Kronos, 3 is enough. You don't need 3, 2 is enough. You don't need 2, 1 is enough. The Kamle Akeren Achas Laki, and therefore Zrika on 1 Keren is Ma'akiv, like Beis Hillel said. The Kol Chad V'chad, each V'chiper Miyet Chada Keren is saying 1 Keren you could omit. The Kamle, after you have 3 V'chipers, so 4 Kronos minus 3 V'chipers, the Kamle Akeren Achas Laki. So that's it would make sense to say that it said the chiper 3 times to reduce the zrikas from 4 kronos to 1. The ikid garment, but if you're going to say that the purpose of the chibar to say that all of the zrikas could be on the lower half of the mizbeach, the yoiv kulu lamata kosher, well then arba v'chiper havale lemichtav. It would have needed 4 v'chipers. Lahachshir arba hamatanis lamata. Now you'll notice there's an interesting nusach in the Gemara. I sort of fluffed over it, but now that we're making the distinction between 3 and 4, let's look at how the Gemara asked that maybe the Chibur is just telling you that you don't have to spritz in the right place, but avada you have to spritz. And what does he say? The lashon of the Gemara's kasha is maybe we should say aim of the chiper afal pi shlonosna l'sholish l'mayla lachas l'mata. So if the chiper number 1 is saying you don't need all 4 zrika spritz on the top half of the mizbeach, 3 is enough. You can do 1 at the bottom. Then the chiper afal pi shlonosna l'shtayim l'mata l'shtayim l'mayla. But then the logic should dictate that the third v'chiper should say even if you only have 1 l'mayla and 3 l'mata. But that is not what the Gemara asks. The Gemara asks, "V'chiper afal pi shlonosna l'mayla ela l'mata." It went from 2 all the way down to 0. What's the logic in that? And continuing on, the Gemara says, if you want to totally eliminate Zrika l'mayla, you should need 4 v'chipers. So that's a kasha that Tosfos asks. And Tosfos says, there's no havamina that you should have 3 you should have 3 lamata and 1 lamayla, because that's splitting up the zrikas. So Rashi, Tosfos asks right over here. I'm sorry. So Tosfos explains. Tamer Tosfos. Amai ifsek mi seder shehischal lidrash. Why suddenly skip from 1 to 0? The havala l'meimar v'chiper alpha pi shalonos and l'maylo ela achas v'shalosh l'mata. And for Tosfos v'yesh loimer the loimash milei lidrash sheyasa l'mata ela behechsher domim hanitnin l'mata. I'm sorry. The loimash milei lidrash sheyasa l'mata ela behechsher domim hanitnin l'mata u'shtayim l'maylo. It wouldn't make sense to say that we will be machsher a zrikas dam on the lower half of the mizbeach with less matanos than the Torah mandates on top. So therefore, shtayim l'mayla, which would be shtayim l'mayla ubeis l'mata. So the l'mashv'lei lidra sheyasa l'mata ela behechsher domim, only with the same hechsher domim hanitin l'mata. So therefore, shtayim l'mayla the kamer that we say as a suggestion, there should be 2 above the Chut HaSikra and 2 below the Chut HaSikra. Hainu sheyasa lamata achas shehishtayim. The suggestion was going to be not to have 2 separate zrikas. The suggestion was actually going to be that there should be 1 zrika that's like we have by other karbonos, where you put the blood on the point and it splits into 2 sides. V'chein v'chiper afal pi shenosan kulon lamata. It was also going to be Hainu Kedin Shar Domim Hanit Lamata, which would be only 2 matanis. So there's a lot more complication to what the Gemara was suggesting with Lamayla Lamata. It wasn't 4 regular zrikas. So therefore, again, so Tosfos kasha is, why doesn't it just say 3 below and 1 above? The Gemara doesn't even want to entertain that. Sheyasa lamata ela behechsher domim hanitin lehechsher domim hanitin lamata. I'm not sure if I'm reading this right. So the lemash lidra sheyasa lamata. The Gemara doesn't have. They should do 3 below the chutz and 1 above. Ela behechsher domim hanitin lamata. Only with hechsher domim, and therefore it should be a proper hechshadam, and therefore we cannot go with 3 below. Ushtayim l'mayla ubeis l'mata. We do have half and half. Hainu sheyasa l'mata achas sheishtayim, which means you would also have 4 because you would have 2 achas sheishtayim, which would end up being 4. So we always want you to have a total of 4. Okay, so that's why when we're talking about achas l'mayla and some lamata, we don't entertain 3 below and 1 above.
Whether it's 1 and 3 or 2 and 2 or 0 and 4, it's always 4. What's the difference if it's 0 and 4 or 1 and 3?
So let's break it down. The Gemara says the first v'chiper was going to say do 1 below and 3 above, right? So the question is how do you have that, right? If the Gemara was willing to entertain 3 above the chut sikra and 1 below, why can't the Gemara entertain the reverse? Okay. So maybe I don't have a clerk. I don't want Tosh was saying. So let's look at Tosh again. Hey, my ifsek miseder shehiskal lidrash davel remember v'chiper avu shlos lamayla lachas shlos lamata. That's the inverse of the first thing that the Gemara said. The Gemara doesn't like that option. Sheyasa lamata. The Gemara doesn't want to do zrikas lamata, ella behechsher damim hanitlin lamata. Only if it would be like the hechsher damim hanitlin lamata, which means comparative to other karbonis that are lamata, and other karbonis that are lamata would be at least 2 zrikas, because we're suggesting that you should have 3 lamata. Now 3 lamata, you never find 3 lamata. Now, if we want to suggest should be lamata, it should be at least comparable to zrikas that the Torah mandates that are lamata. And there's never a mandate to have 3 lamata. What about shtayim lamayla and shtayim lamata? The Kamar, Hainu, even when you're doing it lamata, you should do it the way typical karbonis that need lamata are, which is achash sheishtayim. So therefore, 3 it doesn't like, because 3 is not similar to any zrika that you ever have. So that explains why the Gemara doesn't want to entertain 3 on the bottom and 1 on top, because when we're entertaining zrikas on the lower half of the mizbeach, it should be at least similar to karbonis that are supposed to be spritzed on the lower half of the mizbeach, which would be shtayim shein arba, not 3 individual zrikas. So then we have to go back. So what about 3 on top and 1 below? Why don't you have that same problem there? If they're all down, again, that would also be similar to shar dam nitlamata if they're all at the bottom, because shtayim shein arba 2 times is the 4 times that we're talking about. But if you want to entertain 1 above and 3 below, the 2 zrikas that you're going to do, the 3 zrikas that you're going to do below the chut sikra, if you do 3 zrikas, you're going to have 2 on 2 individual sides of the mizbeach, and the 3rd zrika is going to be a dual zrika because it'll be on the corner. So what's going to happen is these zrikas that are lamata, they themselves aren't equal to one another, because 2 of the zrikas will only be on one side of the mizbeach, and the 3rd zrika will have to be on a point where it will reach 2 walls, because again we want it to be similar to the zrikas that are done lamata lechatchila. So that's the problem. Okay. Avol. So what about the first instance? Avol shalosh lamai levachas lamata. Why was the Gemara willing to entertain that? Avol bi sha'isa achas eina kamishpat. Even though the one now at the bottom is not kamishpat, because kamishpat would be 2, ain't kapeda. There we don't have a kapeda. Kivan sharayv lamayla. Since most of the zrikas are on top, so it's an interesting logic. Tosh was saying if most of the zrikas are on top, I'm not concerned about the fact that there's only 1 zrika on the bottom, even though 1 zrika isn't even parallel to the zrikas of karbonis that belong on the lower half of the mizbeach. But if you have 3 on the bottom, so that's the focus of the zrika, and we know you have to get all 4 sides. So al korchach, 2 are going to be on 1 side, and the 3rd one's going to have to be on 2 sides. So the zrikas themselves are mismatched, and that's why the Gemara didn't want to entertain that. So therefore, Zok Gemara, since we have only 3 v'chipers, it's only logical to say that the Pasuk is trying to tell us that 3 of the zrikas are not mandatory. If you made 1 zrika, it would be enough. So Amar so where we up to? Amar Rabba Ezodav Shtar Shalosh Havu Omer Eloi Kravis. It's more mashma to say that the three v'chibers are saying that instead of all four korbanos, three are enough. Freit the Gemara. Ema v'chiper afa pishalei nosan elo achas l'mayla v'shalosh l'mata. Why don't you say that argument that Tosfos just rejected? Why don't you actually say the same thing and forget about the fact that the zrikas are mismatched? Maybe you learn that if one zrika is l'mayla and three are l'mata, that'll be good. So now the Gemara rejects it all. You never find by any carbon that some dam are spritzed above the chut sukkah and some dam are spritzed below the chut sukkah. So all that conversation that we had about Tosfos was really all just academic, because at the end of the day, the Gemara nukes that whole svar. You could never consider spritzing some blood of a carbon on the top half of the mizbeach and some on the bottom half. You never find a carbon that splits that way, and therefore we are not going to entertain that. Therefore, the vechipers that we have, we're going to apply to telling us that you don't even have to spritz at all 3 out of the 4 shrieks. Frank Gemara, is that a rule that you never find? I'm going to show you otherwise. But none we learned. This we just learned in Yom Kippur. He's al mimenu achas l'mayla v'shev l'mata. Right? That's the avodah Yom Kippur is they spritz achas l'mayla v'shev l'mata. That is clear as day that you do see the blood get split. Zog to Gemara, and it's kamatliv. Zog to Gemara, everything where it's kamatliv. It doesn't mean that one is above on the top half of the mizbeach and 7 are on the bottom half of the mizbeach. It's kamatliv. Kamatliv. What does kamatliv mean? My kamatliv machvi Rabbi Yehuda kimin, which means when someone is getting whipped, they whip not all of the lashes in the same place. They move down as they're going. So it doesn't mean achas l'mayla v'shev l'mata that it was on 2 separate parts of the mizbeach. They were all spritzed on the same part of the mizbeach. It's just that they were done one below the other, so you actually saw the dots of red blood lined up one on top of the other. But they were all l'mayla. Zok to Gemara. Rashi also tells us something very, 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 very interesting. It says in the pasuk that achas l'mayla v'sheva l'mata. It says in the Mishnah, achas l'mayla v'sheva l'mata. So what does achas l'mayla and sheva l'mata mean if you're discounting the whole thing and you're saying that it just means you line them up one below the other? Zok Rashi, all it means is it underhanded or overhanded? Is this a softball pitch or is it a hardball pitch? So achas l'mayla means when he spritzed, he held his hand like this and he spritzed, and sheva l'mata means he held his hand like that and spritzed. But as far as where the spritz landed on the mizbeach, they all landed in the same place. Okay, so from there I don't have a raya. But what about from another place? It says in the Mishnah, Hiza al taharoi shal mizbeach. They spritzed on the tahara of the mizbeach sheva pamim. What is meant by the taharoi shal mizbeach? Where did the kohen spritz this dam when the Mishnah tells us he spritzed it on the tahara shal mizbeach? Tahara means on the right in the middle of the mizbeach, of its height. My love, al palge the mizbeach, right at the center line of the mizbeach. Why would you say that tahira means the center line? Kedamar ishi tahar tira diyoima. When the afternoon arrives and the sun switches from the morning position to the afternoon position, that's a lashon of tahira, the beginning of the afternoon. So it would make sense. Midway on the mizbeach, that's where he was spritzing. Now, when he's doing that, Zok Rashi, the top Rashi, the Yafshel Tamtam, you can't hit exactly the center line in the mizbeach. So it's inevitable. It's inevitable that some of the blood is going to be at the top half and some of the lower half if you're aiming directly for the center line. So here you see, Tahir Shel Mizbeach includes that some of the dam will be spritzed on the top half, some on the lower half. Rabbi Barshila, no, that's not at all what Tahir Shel Mizbeach means. You know what Tahir Shel Mizbeach means? It means on the top of the Mizbeach. Loy agiluya. Giluya means the top of the Mizbeach. So why is it called Tahiroi? Because the kohen, before he spritzed dam on the Mizbeach, he had to move all of the ashes to the side so that the top surface of the Mizbeach was exposed to directly be makabel the dam that he was spritzing. So we're comparing it to Etam Shemaim Torah because the Torah says that we're going to have clarity Lavoi, like the clear sky when there's no clouds blocking. So it's a lashon of clearing. That's what tahira means. But of course, it's talking about the top of the mizbeach, and therefore, all that Mishnah means is that all of the zrikas are on top of the mizbeach. Okay, Zok Gemara, but va'ikishirayim, even if you're spritzing all the blood on top of the mizbeach, the shiyari adam, where are you spilling? On the yesod of the mizbeach hachitzon. So clearly, the dam that you're spritzing on the mizbeach hapnimi is above the chut sikra. It's on top, but the dam that you're spilling out as shirayim, that's going at the bottom of the mizbeach hachitzon. Zok Gemara, you can't be mirai from shirayim. Shirayim loy ma'aktiv. Shirayim are ma'aktiv. Even if he doesn't spill out those shirayim on the side, the carbon is kosher anyway. Frekt Gemara, but va'ika shirayim ha'panimim, the ikaman the amar ma'akve. But the fact is, on the karbanos that you're makriv the blood b'pnim, there are a shita who holds that those shirayim are ma'akve, as I mentioned earlier. Meaning, it's a mandatory part of the avodas hadam. After you do the zrika on the mizbeach, you have to take that dam and pour it on the side of the mizbeach chitzon. Otherwise, the carbon is not kosher. So you see dam get split from above to below. I meant you never find on one mizbeach, you would spritz some of the matanas on the top half and some on the lower half. If there's a mitzvah to do the dam on the mizbeach hapnimi, and there's a mitzvah to spill out the shiraim on the mizbeach chitzon, there we don't care if it's not in the same position because it's two different mizbeachs. So at the end of the day, the Gemara's conclusion is that v'chiper, the three times that it says v'chiper, is to tell us that 3 out of the 4 zrikas for our carbon chatas is not mandatory, which Basil exports to all karbonis, and therefore 1 matana will be mandatory. And the Gemara discounts that the Chiber cannot be telling you about the positioning of the dam because you'll never find any zrika where some are going to be spritzed above the mizbech or on the top half of the mizbech and some below. So the Chiber is telling you that the whole zrika is not mandatory. Zok Gemara weiter. Tanya Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer. Bei Shammai says, Shtei matanois shebechatas v'achas shebecholas v'achim. So we know Bei Shammai said that when it comes to a chatas, you have to have at least 2 matanos. But all other components, you have to at least have 1 matan. So the halacha is matiros umefaglos. They will be matir and they will be mefaglos. Meaning, Zok Rashi, Shtei mashal shebechatas matiros kol zman sheloi nitin shtayim. According to Bei Shammai, if you're doing the zrika of the dam of a carbon chatas until he does the second zrika, which according to Bei Shammai is mandatory by a chatas, lehutru emurin la'aktorah. You cannot yet put the emurim on the mizbeach. The emurim can only get put on the mizbeach once we had the heter zrika. And you wouldn't be able to eat the basar after 1 matana. You need to see 2 matanos by a chatas, according to Bei Shammai. Umefaglois, meaning im nosan shteyem b'machshavas pigel. What if both of those 2 matanos were spritzed when the kohen had in mind to eat the carbon chutlas man? They would be pigel. But what would happen? What if the 2 zrikas that the kohen is doing for the carbon pesach, the first zrika was with a good kavanah, and only the second zrika did he have kavanah of eating the carbon chutlas manai, loy pigel. There wouldn't be pigel because he holds the ein mefagel mechati mater. The mater of the carbon are 2 zrikas. You have to have in order to make this into pigel, you have to have a machshava of pigel by both those 2 zrikas. Having a machshava of pigel only by one of them is not a good pigel because ein mefagel mechati mater. Remember, we had this before when we were talking about the shchita. Is each siman a separate shchita, or is it all one shchita? But if you hold ein mefagel mechati mater and the 2 zrikas are the mater, then you have to have a kavanah of pigel by both zrikas in order to make it pigel. Okay, so to Gemara weiter. Tanya Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer, V'sham Elohim Shtei matanos shebechatas v'achas shebecholos v'achim matiros. You need them both to be mater, umefaglois, and it'll only be pigel if you have a machshava of pigel by both of those zrikas. V'sil Omer, achas shebechatas v'achas shebecholos v'achim. Sai by achatas, sai by al zvachim, only 1 zrika is mandatory, so therefore materos, even 1 would be mater, umefagelos. because again, it's only one zrika. There's no chatzi mater according to Beis Hillel, because the second zrika is no longer ma'akev. It's only the first zrika that counts. So as long as you had a kavanah pigel during the first zrika, it's going to be pigel. So in fact, you have over here a scenario where it's a kula according to Beis Hillel, because where it's a chumrah according to Beis Hillel. Because according to Beis Hillel, if you had kavanah of pigel by one of the zrikas, it would be pigel. According to Beis Shammai, if you had machshav of pigel by one of the two zrikas, it would not be pigel. So you have an interesting scenario where Beis Hillel is mekel and Beis Shammai is mekel and Beis Hillel is machmer. So maskavul Rabbi Ishia im kain. If this is an example of where Beis Hillel is machmer and Beis Shammai is mekel, lisanya gabekula Beis Shammai v'chumah Beis Hillel. So why don't we list this case as an example of one of the exceptions where Beis Shammai was actually mekel and Beis Hillel was actually machmer? Amalei Rava, I'll tell you why. Because ki itchel leter itchel. The machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is really not discussing pigel. That's an unintended cause. But the primary machlokes is how many zrikas do you need to do to be matter the carbon? Beis Hillel says one, which is a kula. Beis Shammai says two, which is a chumrah. Yes, it comes out based on that calculation that it'll be harder to make it pigel according to Beis Shammai. But that's not listed as a kula of Beis Shammai. That's just the impact of his chumrah dekapsa. Therefore, the main shaila was legabe eteireichel the havalu Beis Shammai lechumrah. This is still considered Beis Shammai lechumrah. Amar b'yochanan shalosh matanos shebechatois. You have to bring all four according to Beis Hillel, right? But three of them, if you didn't do it, it wouldn't be mak of the carbon. But you still have to do it, right? So the question is, they obviously have some impact of a zrika, but not the full impact, because the carbon is mutter without it. But you're still supposed to do it like a tchila. So they're zrika, but they're not with the same strength as the first zrika. So therefore, let's see how it impacts halachas about zrika. Number one, einam bois b'layla. You cannot do avodah by night. These three zrikas, even though they're not ma'akev, they're still considered a zrika that you're not allowed to do it by night. Okay? Ubois la'achamisa. Now the other thing is the einam bois b'layla ubois la'achamisa. What happens if the owner of the carbon is a chatas? Normally, if the owner of a carbon chatas dies, you dispose of the carbon. You're not ma'akev it. What happens over here if the owner of the carbon died? So Zak Rashi, it's a kosher carbon chatas, because the kapar happened with the first rika while the bailam was still alive, and therefore the ein shem chatas gemura aladam oid lipasel mishum chatas shemesu bailah. It will not be considered a chatas shemesu bailah because the chatas was already mechaper for the bailam. Okay, so what we have over here so far, it has different features. Ein bois b'layla has the feature of a regular zrika, but a bois lachamisa is not the feature of a zrika, because what we're saying is that you could do these rikas even after Misa Bailam. Okay, how about v'maylam and b'chutz chayiv? The halacha is if you make zrika of a carbon chutz lebeis hamikdash, you're chayiv kares. It's like shchutei chutz. Are these zrikas considered a zrika? L'gabi that, yes, they are. So they have the identification of a real zrika that if you do it b'chutz you're chayiv and you're not allowed to do it b'layla. Okay, about them. Amar Papa, yeshman ketchilasoi v'yeshman kesoi. There are certain ways in which these rikas are like the original rika, which are ma'akev, and there are certain ways where this rika is not so serious. And he goes through a list. Chutz, we know that if you spritz b'chutz you're chayiv, so l'gabi that it's like ketchilasoi. V'layla, you're not allowed to do this rika at night. It's also like ketchilasoi. Zarus, a zor may not make these additional three zrikas. That also treats it like the original zrika. Uchlei sharis, it has to be done in the klesharis. The dam has to be handled in the klesharis. Keren, they have to be spritzed on the keren of the mizbeach. The etzba, and it has to be done with the finger of the kohen. we're up to kibus. The halacha is dam that has to be spritzed on the mizbeach. If it dam of achatos that has to be spritzed on the mizbeach, if it spritzes on a beged, that beged needs to be washed out. V'shirayim, and the halacha is the shirayim gets spilled on the yisoid like shiorei dam kitchilasan. So in these ways, the additional 3 zrikas is like the original zrika that's mechuyev. Let's have a look at Rashi. Yesh kitchilasoi yesh midvarim shebeteres domim shashalosh matonos kematana rishona. There are ways where they're like the matana rishona. V'yesh dvarim shebeteres shiorei dam. Chutz is hazor kosher chutz is chayiv. Why? Because they could be spritzed inside. You cannot make these rikas by night. The nifslum is milizrik. Vazrika, it's a zrika. Zor is chayiv misa. Utuunas klisharis. Umatanas espa. They have to be handled with the klisharis, and the matanas dam is done with the finger. V'chibus imnitas midam machatas ala beged. If one of these, the extra blood from the 3 zrikas, went on a beged that has to be washed out, and avolum nosen kol matnaisel. But if you already gave all the matanis dam, what if you did all the zrikas required, and then the dam went on your beged? That doesn't have to be washed because the chiv zrika is no longer on this dam. Shirayim, meaning chatos shekibel dama ba'arba koises. Oh, that's the case for shirayim. What happens if you were makabel the dam of a chatos instead of in one big kois? It's in 4 koises. We had this shaila earlier. And each kois was used for 1 zrika. They're all considered shirayim, even though the last 3 weren't mandatory. So in that way, this blood, the extra 3 zrikas, is like the first zrika. But it has some features that are like not a zrika. For instance, chutz v'layla. I'm sorry. Is over here. Misa loy sharia v'loy mafalga v'loy la'ayla gavoy kisoifa. So what are these 4 things? So misa means bois la'acher misa kida amar leil. We said that even though the Bailam died, you could still do the original, the final 3 zrikas. So you see, it's not like a regular zrika, because a regular zrika you wouldn't be able to do once the Bailam died. Loy shari means basar shekvar hutar. The last 3 zrikas won't be mat to the meat, because the meat was already mutter to eat after the first zrika. V'loy mafagla. If the first zrika was done with the proper kavanah, and then afterwards, when you did the additional 3 that weren't mandatory, you had a machshava pigel, it would not be mafagel. So that's a way where it's not like a zrika. And v'loy ayla, meaning ein lahem tayras psul kanisas pnim. The halacha is if you have dam that's taken into the heichal, it will pass all the dam. But these 3, if you bring them in, the last 3 zrikas, you brought that dam in, it wouldn't pass all, because kisoifan, it's like shirayim, it doesn't have all of the halachas of blood. Amar Papa Mina Minala. How do I know this halacha that you don't that you have to wash out the blood of the gods on the beged? So you made 1 zrika, you have the remaining blood for the other 3 zrikas. That blood went on the beged. How do I know you have to wash it out? The Tanan we learned nitas minatzaver ala beged. What if blood went straight from the neck of the animal onto a beged, meaning there was no kabbalah sadam? So this is dam that you cannot use for zrika. Einoi ton kibus. You don't need kibus. Why? Because this is not dam that could be used for zrika. But what about mina keren or mina yisoid? What if dam came off the keren or dam came off the yisoid? Again, einoi ton kibus. Why? Because this is dam that you've already discharged the chiyuv of zrika. Only dam that has a chiyuv zrika on it is there a chiyuv to wash it out. And we can make a diak. Ha mina royal keren, but dam that was on the keren, you don't have to wash out. But if it's dam that's going to be headed to the keren, like all this dam inside of first zrika, inside all 3 zrikas, ton kibus, that requires washing. So vibalt, even the dam of the final 3 zrikas, also you need a zrika for. If that dam goes onto a beged, there is a chiyuv to wash it out. Frankly, tomorrow you're not making a good deal because you're being medayik mina keren. You don't need kibus, but royal keren does need kibus. Well, are you going to make the same deal by mina yisoid? Look, mina yisoid, if it's off the yisoid itself, it's shirayim that you already poured. That's einatam kibus. Are you going to make a deal? Royally side time kibbutz. What does royally side means? Royally side means you already made this rikas adam, and now you're pouring the shirayim. Are you going to tell me that needs kibbutz? You already spritzed. Asher yazaksiv. Prat lozeh shekvar huza. Dam that's headed to the side, meaning you spritzed the dam already. There is no chiv kibbutz. So Zoktimar will stop with this. Hamani Rab Nechemia. It's going according to Rab Nechemia. It's not Rab Nechemia Omer Shiyori Adam Sheakriva Mechutz Chayiv. Rab Nechemia holds that the shirayim that you pour on the side by al karbonis are part of the avodas Adam, and if you pour the shirayim chutz lazora, that's chayiv al shchutei chutz. So therefore, he still considers the dam before you pour it onto the shirayim. He considers that dam to be active dam, and therefore there'll be a chiv kibbutz. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll finish tomorrow. So we're in the middle of seeking a makar for a papa that the dam of the three additional zrikas, that dam also has a din of regular dam, and if it went onto a beged, it needs to be washed. That's what we're looking for a makar for, which we're going to struggle with. Stop here.